Item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda items 5 and 6 in private. Item 5 is consideration of the evidence heard today, and item 6 is consideration of our work programme. Rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume your consent. Does anyone object? Thank you very much then. That is agreed. Items 5 and 6 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2 is consideration of the draft Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act 2020, meetings of Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisations, Coronavirus Regulations 2020. The committee will first take evidence on the instrument, and I welcome Aileen Campbell, Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, and Jamie McQueen, Lawyer, and Caroline Monk, Senior Policy Officer, Scottish Government. This instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means that the Parliament must approve it before the provisions can come into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider the motion to approve the instrument. I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement.
Okay, good morning, Convener, good morning, Committee. It's good to be with you to move this SSI. These regulations will allow Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisations, SCIOs, to continue to hold remote meetings with their members, even where their constitution would not normally allow this. SCIOs make up 19% of the 25,000 charities registered in Scotland. With the current COVID-19 restrictions, holding members' meetings in person will not be possible. By law, SCIOs have to hold certain members' meetings, and these regulations extend the time period that they can do so by remote means to the 30th of December 2020. So I recognise how important it is that charities are able to continue the vital work that they do throughout their communities. These technical regulations contribute to the overall package of support that Scottish Government are providing to charities at this time. So it's a technical regulation, and I look forward to taking questions from the committee if they have any.
Thank you very much for that, Minister. And we now move on to questions from members. If you have a question, I'd be grateful if you'd notify via the digital channels available to you. Just type R for request. Call anyone who wants to ask a question in turn by name, and please allow a second for the mic to be operated. Any questions? Andy Whiteman.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I'm just wondering why the extension is to the 31st of December 2020, not to the end of the next emergency period, 31st of March 2021.
Okay, it keeps it in line with the rest of the UK. It keeps it consistent, and it's part of the 3-month extension. So again, if there's further extension that needs to be made, we'll need to look at that again. But in the intervening time, we'll make sure that we continue to engage with OSCR and other relevant bodies to make sure that that we can support as best we can.
So to be clear, if the circumstances that have necessitated this SSI are still there in December, going into 2021, you'll bring forward another SSI. Is that the case?
If that's required, we'll continue to use this period though to others, and if we require to extend it further, then again we can look at that. The Act allows Scottish Ministers to extend the relevant period by 3 months at a time, with the final backstop being the 5th of April 2021. So again, like I said in the previous response, we'll continue discussions with stakeholders to make sure that we can work out what's required and what's necessary.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. As there's no further questions,
sorry, I just for clarity, it's been brought to my attention that it might be that it needs to be clarified for the official report that this is a made affirmative rather than draft affirmative. So it comes into force on the 30th of September regardless of approval by the Parliament. Okay. I can bring in Jamie McQueen if that's helpful.
Right, thank you very much for that. I've also got Sarah Boyack coming in. I missed that she'd asked to come in.
Thanks very much, Convener. It was just to ask the Cabinet Secretary, what's the experience been in the last 6 months as this legislation has been in place? Thanks, Convener.
Yep.
I understand that this is being really testing for many organisations and charities in particular. So I understand that there's been lots of use of different technologies, and again, Oscar and others stand ready to support that work going forward. Many charities, I think, have been creative and have used a combination of different methods to have meetings that have suited their membership. Again, that's anecdotal from Oscar. Some charities are holding meetings, have seen a bigger uptake in member participation in previous years. So that's some anecdotal evidence from Oscar about what's been happening over the last wee while, and we'll continue to work with Oscar to ensure that the right supports are in place should charities feel that they require it. So it seems like it's been okay and that charities have been coping. Again, that probably is a symbol of the agility and nimbleness of this sector more generally, that they're able to be quite resilient in the face of the challenges that they're facing.
Thank you. Okay, Sarah? Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Right. In that case, I move on to agenda item 3, which is formal consideration of motion S5M 22819, calling for this committee to recommend approval of the draft regulations we have just taken evidence on. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move the motion and any other further comments she wants to make.
I move the made affirmative regulations. Again, I would just want to be clear that we're understanding that it's made affirmative and not draft affirmative.
Okay, thank you. Contributions from any members? Okay, in that case, the question is that motion S5M 22819 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government be approved. Are we all agreed? Thank you. In that case, that is agreed. The committee will report on the instrument in due course. I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report of the publication. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I thank the Cabinet Secretary and official for taking part in this meeting. I will now suspend briefly to allow a witness changeover. Thank you very much. Just stay where we are, please, the rest of us. Agenda item 4, the committee is taking evidence in next year's Scottish budget. The theme of our scrutiny this year is the impact of COVID-19 in Scotland's councils within the wider context of the long-term financial sustainability of Scottish local government. We've already heard from the Accounts Commission, and over the next 2 weeks we'll be hearing from a diverse cross-section of bodies with a very direct interest in local government services. I welcome today the following, all attending remotely: George Ecton, Director of Advice Services Citizens Advice Scotland; Alison Watson, Director of Shelter Scotland; and Charlie McMillan, Chief Executive, Scottish Commission for Learning Disability. I'm grateful to you for taking time to answer our questions, and for information, we've allocated just over 1 hour for this session, and we have a number of issues to discuss with you. We'll move on straight on to questions in a moment after some technical information. For the benefit of broadcasting, there is a pre-arranged order, and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for a block of up to 8 minutes. It would also help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to. We may have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end. As there are 3 people in the panel, please indicate clearly if you wish to answer the question, for instance by raising your hand, and don't feel the need to answer every question fully if your views are generally in line with points already made. And please, could everyone give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. Thank you. We'll now move on to questions, and I will begin with the first question, which is about the area of service and cooperation which generated the most concern or levels of complaints from service users before the COVID-19 pandemic, and whether you think there's been a change in the pattern of concerns that the service users have. Any volunteers here? Alison could ask. Thank you.
I suppose the broader context for this is that even before the pandemic, we were seeing very significant problems with people accessing local authority support in terms of homelessness. We had every sign that we had a housing and homelessness system under severe duress. The annual homelessness statistics that were published a few weeks ago made clear that we've now had 3 consecutive years of increases in homelessness. We still have a housing system that is in effect rationing a scarce resource, that scarce resource being social housing. What Shelter Scotland has seen during the pandemic is people finding it much more difficult to navigate a system that was already causing difficulties. Particular challenges around accessing discretionary housing benefit, for example, people finding the system quite confusing, people finding that there's less access to face-to-face support. And I think there's a real need to see some greater consistency in terms of how people can access this key source of support. And we also need to get clarification about how the DHP pot will be topped up in effect to make sure that people, at least until April, don't have a sense of the system being rationed out over the year, which we sense is possibly what's happening. There's also been concerns raised with us from a number of clients about finding council services more inaccessible. Situations where obviously some services are defaulting to telephone, but it feels like there's a limited number of people staffing those rotas, and people feeling that that's adding to the difficulties about accessing services. And I think in a general sense, the stress that we're seeing in the system is exacerbating very significant duress that was there before. I think we are in the joint Ending Homelessness Together plan. We're setting out quite rightly very high ambitions to end homelessness in Scotland. But I think we absolutely need to see the right resources and the right support put in place for local authorities if they can truly fulfil those promises and also deliver on what is a set of highly progressive housing rights in Scotland. We have to see those rights be consistently applied, and that will require a different resourcing framework from the one that we've got currently in place.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Charlie McMillan, please, and then George Ecton. Charlie.
Yes, similar convener in terms of the comments that Alison had made there. The pandemic did not cause the difficulties that people with learning disabilities are facing. It exacerbated them and in many cases shone a light on them. Certainly, there was a key issue with the withdrawal of care and support in the very early days of the pandemic from some local authority health and social care partnerships, and that had a significant impact on many people. There seemed to be an assumption that we would be unable to continue to provide the public services that we had. And where someone has an identifiable member of the family, whether they lived nearby or not, they were asked to stand in their stead. This issues in terms of loneliness, and the most common word actually used by people with learning disabilities and some families and carers is abandonment by public services. And that's been a significant issue throughout the last 6 months. Also aware, because of the poor outcomes that people were learning in general, despite all of the work ongoing in terms of strategy and policy, and there is significant work happening, but there are key issues for people's experience in terms of how they regain how they regain confidence and their ability to feel part of communities. So a range of problems moving forward that ourselves at SCLD and our portfolio group of learning disability services we're part of are working to address, but really fundamentally believe that we see the last 6 months and the ongoing as an opportunity to build forward differently, not return to how it was before, and actually put people with learning disabilities, their families and carers at the heart of everything that we do.
Thanks for that. See, before I bring George in, can I just ask both Alison and yourself, is there any sort of new concerns that have been raised, or is it the same concerns that have just been exacerbated by the ongoing situation?
Alison, do you want to go first?
Yes, I mean, I think yes, we are seeing a deep exacerbation of problems that were already there. I think it's also about how we use the learning from the emergency measures that have put in place, because I think that does give us an opportunity to understand better how to support particularly vulnerable people. And I think as we look towards the winter months, bringing that learning forward into our plans feels even more important. And I think that's about making sure that the people who do have a roof over their head don't lose that protection. We've understood during this pandemic that housing is absolutely central to protecting people's health, protecting people's well-being. We very strongly welcome the continuing ban on evictions. We have to make sure that that is consistently applied across the social sector and the private rented sector. I had a great conversation with Police Scotland yesterday, for example, about growing concerns that we have about illegal evictions in the private rented sector. So I think it is about making sure that we use the learning from the pandemic to plan further improvements. I think the key message for us remains that there just aren't enough social homes to tackle Scotland's housing emergency. That needs to be the key lesson that we take forward as we look towards next year's general election in particular. We have to keep up the momentum on building affordable homes.
Thank you very much. Charlie?
Yeah, two key points for us. One would be the need for meaningful data collection. One of the huge issues that we experienced on an ongoing basis is reliable data disaggregated down to the level of people with learning disabilities. Unfortunately, they're often missed, and that then means that actually having reliable information on their experience is really, really difficult. So we're still assessing what the impact of the pandemic has been. And that data collection absolutely needs to be in line with Article 31 of the UNHCR. And we're really working with a range of partners to ensure that data collection happens. But in terms of local government, data collection needs to be improved considerably. The other big issue, probably new, although we were aware of it, absolutely in terms of it's come centre stage, if you like, is digital exclusion of everything that dependent on this digital world. And I have to apologise for the quality even of my broadband. Despite all the privilege that I've got, this is a real challenge in this world. But for people with learning disabilities and disabled people in general of significant mean that a lot of what's actually happening in a positive way at the moment misses them entirely.
Okay.
So digital exclusion is a key issue for us, heightened in the pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much for that. George, sorry for keeping you waiting.
Convener, thank you. Just in terms of, maybe to reiterate what the last two speakers have said, certainly one of our key concerns has been access to services. I think during the pandemic, for us as a service ourselves, we saw sort of a halving of those clients who were either our normal, regular, vulnerable clients or those suffering ill health, and we would imagine that that would be pretty similar across most public services, and that really was a concern for us, where understandably at the time councils were having to utilise phone or more online forms of advice, but actually with them being such an impersonal client journey for those who are most vulnerable and requiring face-to-face support, then that was always going to be a real concern that was being expressed through our network, and that's why we were very grateful for continuing discussions with the Scottish Government about being able to open up our advice services to face-to-face at the end of August to enable those who we felt were missing from our normal client group and users of all public services to access that kind of face-to-face support that is so vital.
Okay, listen, thank you very much for that. I'm going to bring in Vice Deputy Convener Sarah Boyatt. Sarah?
Thank you very much, Convener. First of all, can I draw members' attention to my register of interest in relation to my former employment with SFHA and my membership with Unison. I'm very keen to follow on that line of conversation started by the Convener about access to services, and you've all just talked about the digital exclusion issue. Can you say how you think that might be addressed? Because we're clearly not through the pandemic. We have months to go in it, and we're moving into winter. So can I maybe kick off with Charlie McMillan, because you talked about building forward differently. What does that look like in terms of supporting people to get access to services where they don't have that, where either access to digital is hard to do or the access to digital doesn't meet their needs?
It's very much both, absolutely. Where it's access to equipment, where people are able to interact with digital equipment but don't have it, the programme Alliance worked very hard with those people who required equipment, and that was funded through the Scottish Government's digital inclusion work. We would really be keen for that to be expanded and very much targeted at those people with learning disability. For example, we've got one individual we're working with on a support basis. We were never previously a support organisation. That's just part of the change. And up until we were able to secure him some digital equipment, suicide attempts, the digital inclusion has made him meaningful ability to be part of society, community, where he lives. So that has helped significantly, and his mental health is improving on an ongoing basis. However, you're absolutely right. For some people, digital is not going to be the answer, or if it is, it's going to be very sophisticated digital equipment that's required. Eye gaze, for example, for some people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. We need to be a much more digital society. And I smile as I say that, given the challenges that I face with digital equipment, but we need to be able to dig into the detail of what is appropriate for people, how do they access it, how do they use it, and see it much more as part of our infrastructure. It's a necessity for us all to live our lives. So a massive amount of work to do generally, but then in terms specifically of that dig down on issues for disabled people, it really is significant.
Thank you. And Alison Watson, you
just before you come in, can I just say, Charlie, it's been suggested that we turn off your video and see if the quality of the sound is better. Right, and you're happy with that? Thank you very much. My apologies, Sarah.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had constituents who it's the lack of capacity in their home, and then the fact that digital doesn't work for the person that they're the carer of. So very much take those points on board. Can I move that question on to Alison from Shelter? You talked about the difficulty of accessing services. To what extent is it a digital issue in terms of kit, and to what extent is it just the lifestyles that people who don't actually have access to a secure home face in terms of not being able to get that support?
I mean, the feedback that we're getting from people who come to us for help would point to the fact that it's both of those issues, and I think there's also a resourcing issue there, Sarah. So I think we're aware, for example, that with libraries being closed, that's quite often a place where people will go to access computers, to process benefit claims, etc. That's not a facility that's available to people. And I think people trying to access local authorities now by telephone only, I think there are issues about how the telephones are being staffed, whether there's enough capacity. We're certainly hearing stories of people not being able to get through to local authorities, and we're talking about people in fairly urgent situations. We've had situations, going back to the points I was making about DHP, about people having to get us to have an advisor in their own home, printing off the form, posting it to the client completes the form, takes it back to us, etc. And with all of that being done, it's added 6 weeks to the process of that particular client, just trying to get money through. And during the pandemic, I'm sure everyone would understand that making sure that people have ready access to the resources that they need to keep themselves going is absolutely vital. I think to go back to your other point about some of the additional challenges that we see for people facing homelessness, I think that is very much in the mix. And I think what we would urge is, rather than us trying to second guess what better looks like in this context, we would really urge the need to consult people, particularly people who've got mental health issues, people who've got substance misuse issues. Let's ask those people what would better look like for them in terms of making sure that they can still access the vital help that they need from local authorities. But the evidence that we get from people certainly highlights that we will continue to need some sort of a mix. Not everybody can access digital. What can we do on telephone? How can we get the right capacity there, as well as looking at what are the possibilities around some form of face-to-face assistance being available?
And have you had discussions with local authorities about that? Because it's clearly an issue, I know, in my own area, where people have maybe got short-term accommodation but can't be inside all the time during the day, so are outside. So that raises issues about access to digital capacity if they don't have the right kit. What are the solutions on the ground? Because we're moving into winter, where we've always had a challenge with homelessness. What difference is going to need to be delivered over the next few months?
I think there is, as I said, if there's a capacity issue, that points to a resourcing issue. And I think we now need to recognise that what has felt like a fairly linear progression moving out of lockdown, that is now a trend that we understand is absolutely moving, unfortunately, in reverse gear, that with rising cases and the reintroduction of restrictions, I think we need to understand that we're looking at quite possibly another 6 months of restrictions, and I think it's time to take a fresh look at the resources that are required to make sure that people can still get access to the vital help that they need, protect themselves, and also to get that protection for the wider community about making sure that people have a roof over their head, particularly with the winter months coming ahead, as you say.
Thanks. And if I've got time, Convener, can I ask George Ecton from Citizens Advice Scotland about digital access, because it's absolutely critical. We've just heard from Alison Watson the challenge of getting support, if it's DWP, if it's support from the Scottish Government, the new £500 grant that will be available for certain key workers. How do people access those resources, and what's been the experience of Citizens Advice Scotland?
I think the experience, Deputy Convener, has been that we try to differentiate how we provide our support. I think there does need to be a no wrong door policy to how people can access advice. We're very clear that digital first would be could exclude quite a number of people who either don't have the skills, kit, or if they're even trying to access a distributed call centre over the internet, not necessarily the stability of connection that will keep them in that call for the length of time it will take to get through to a already overcapacity call centre. So I think there does need to be that kind of no wrong door approach. It's certainly how we tried to take our response through the pandemic. We've set up aggregated national helpline with all bureau seek to contribute in some way, shape or form to that national gateway to enable people to at least have another form of access into bureau. Certainly we've seen face-to-face was our unique selling point February time and our main point of access to our bureau network. That's dropped down to below 1 to 2% in August time. So we're very aware that we need face-to-face back, why we have discussions with the government, especially for those who are the most vulnerable. But it does need to be that very clear matrix of options to enable people to access services.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sarah. Alexander.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. If I can continue some of this, but talk about the demographics that we see across parts of Scotland. We have seen a massive increase in demographics that has a knock-on effect as to what kind of services can be provided and supported. And during the pandemic, that has meant that some councils are under even more pressure to manage to support and sustain some of the services, and even manage to deal with the quantity of people that they have to engage with to ensure that they can provide that. So it would be interesting to see, possibly from Charlie first, about what that demographic impact is having on the organisations that you look after, but also the pressures that are coming into councils.
Who's that aimed at, Alex?
Thanks. In terms of the organisation, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, in terms of the experience of the partner organisation, it really was about how to change the delivery model. How do we pivot what we do? And despite having discussed in depth there the challenges of the digital world, moving very much to a digital world, even in terms of some of the social connection work being done using club nights, for example, on a Friday night, one of our partner organisations regularly delivering those for up to 100 people at a time. We've done things in the last 6 months that we wouldn't have envisaged just.
We've lost them.
Social media contact members, they are desperate for connection despite the physical distancing, and it's how we absolutely build those innovations in. However, going back to some of the earlier points, real basic things as well, in terms of, we worked with Tay and designed and delivered 12,000 hard copy resources, self-help books to people with learning disabilities in the first 3 months of the pandemic. We were overwhelmed with the response. Getting it to people meant working really creatively with a printer, finding solutions in terms of postage, but it was possible. And so it's really about how do we pivot what we're doing. The challenges, I think, moving on in terms of because we're really aware of for day open, for respite services to reopen, is how to do that safely in the world that we are living in. However, the need, if you like, to has been exacerbated, and I think that was maybe the point that you were making there as well. There's more need, not less need, and to be considered. But by talking to the individuals, and this point was made earlier about real co-production, real co-creation, speak to the parents and carers of people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, see what would help them best. Those will be the ways that we'll find a way forward.
Thank you, Charlie. Alison, can I ask you the similar thing? Did you find that the demographics are having a massive impact on the pressures that councils are facing?
I think the problem is probably more about volume rather than demographics from what we're seeing, I would suggest. We saw in the Scottish Housing Regulators very helpful monthly bulletins. We've now got a situation where we've got over 14,000 households in temporary accommodation. Local authorities are really struggling to provide enough settled accommodation of the right quality to move people onto, and we're really worried about that bottleneck going on and on. We are also mindful that local authorities are under pressure from rising homelessness. Local authorities are projecting increases in homelessness of anything from 2 to 10% in the next few months. We're also aware, as are others, about the worsening economic impact of the pandemic. We're already getting people coming to us with significant concerns about money and debt, concerns about keeping up with their housing costs. And we think there's going to be an exceptional level of rent arrears coming probably towards the end of this calendar year, probably into next year, particularly as the furlough scheme changes into a new phase. And we particularly, I think we have to anticipate quite significant job losses from that. So it's an issue about volume. It's how do local authorities get support to put enough temporary accommodation in place so that make sure that people who need it get temporary accommodation. But we don't let people languish there. We move them on to settled accommodation. Back to my earlier points about we have to see a decisive move towards increasing the supply of social homes. And
following on from that, if I can maybe ask you a question, George, about the momentum. Your organisation has had to deal with a vast array of inquiries across the pandemic. But can I ask about at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a real momentum to get things done, and there was a real force, and that was well documented. But as we move forward, is that changing, and is that having an effect on individuals who come and require and need support from you?
I think certainly in the early days of the pandemic and early weeks, there was a real momentum. We pivoted our service delivery model from face-to-face to setting up an emergency response helpline that was done in 4 weeks, was ready after Easter, and has subsequently taken and given advice to people. We've received 22,000 calls since it started, and issued significantly more pieces of individual advice. I think there is a clear continuing desire to keep that particular form of access and gateway to our local networks and local bureaus. As a membership organisation, members keen to do that, but also keen to get back to face, as I've said previously, because there is a clear feeling that for the really most vulnerable, with the money that we've been given by the Scottish Government for personal protective equipment and trying to open on a very targeted basis as outlined by government guidance, that'll be really very helpful to those who are seeking advice and who are most vulnerable. But generally as well, across our network stats, we're seeing that we're getting more and more new clients, people who are repeat clients, are new to the network, haven't come to us before. They're more likely to be younger owner-occupiers and in employment than repeat clients, and that is just showing the massive amount of demand that I think our network is admirably trying to cope with. As a volunteer-led network, doing the best we can with the resources that we have available and trying to differentiate our message from our online public advice site, the collective helpline approach, web chat, and also face-to-face, and dealing with emails within local bureaus, local telephony. So there is still the momentum there, but I think we are trying to keep those multi-channels of advice as open and available to give ourselves the widest possible offer and really have a no wrong door approach to accessing the service.
And how sustainable is that in the current climate where the financial packages of the envelope is being reduced and where councils themselves and other organisations are saying that they have had to endure financial issues that they didn't anticipate during this pandemic, and that has a knock-on effect for organisations like your own, George, as to how you can sustain that and support people going forward.
It's a challenging financial climate, I realise, for everyone in delivery of public services, and certainly it's a clear impact for us if we've given out, I think, 80,000 pieces of advice in August. That, like others have said, given the economic forecast going forwards, is that demand for advice is sadly not going to reduce over the autumn and winter period, and that will have real implications for how much and how quickly we can deal with each inquiry going forwards. That is going to, any form of resource can only be spread out amongst our members by individual councils according to their own budgets. But if there is a reduction, then clearly, although we're volunteer-led, we've potentially a lower cost base. The massive amount of demand will be quite a wave over what we could have done differently. So there is a real concern that going forwards we are going to be faced with significant increase in demand and a kind of stable capacity.
Okay.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Alexander. Keith?
Yeah, I wonder if we just heard there from Citizens Advice Scotland about how they've tried to adapt their services and be as responsive as they can be in the new circumstances. And I would imagine that is true for local authorities and others that are providing the services. They've had many people off self-isolating, people having contracted COVID as well. So it's understandable there's been pressure on services. I just wonder, though, from the three panellists, whether they're able to say, given their experience during the pandemic, whether there is something they can point to about the way a service has been changed, which might suggest a longer-term change, a positive, innovative way that some services have changed. And I ask that because I'm kind of conscious that already I think we're in a situation where words like building back better, building back differently, how it's going to look and so on, just become placeholders eventually if you don't put some skin on the bones and say what it should look like. Are there innovations which have taken place which you think are ones which could be continued into the future to the benefit of the people trying to access services?
Anyone in particular, Keith?
Well, if George wants to have a go first, it would be great.
George?
Thank you, Convener. Certainly, in terms of building back better, I think there has been quite a lot of transformation of service that has been undertaken across public sectors, certainly councils, and whether there's an opportunity there to build back better in terms of, certainly in the context of any forthcoming local government's review, around how voluntary sector and public sector could collaborate. In terms of specific channels, I think being able to have quite a wide and differentiated approach there to whether it's web chat, which may be more out of hours provision, collective telephony to try and really triage or deal with very pressing cases and a way of managing demand, but also that we don't forget in all this sense that of a digital first era or rebuilding of services that actually really for the most vulnerable, what has been our unique selling point as a network for over 80 years is face-to-face provision by people in communities for communities is absolutely vital to continue if we are going to build back better, because those who are most vulnerable and who we can take the most preventative spend out of pressing public services need to be seen face-to-face within their communities by volunteers on an ongoing basis going forwards if we continue kind of wellbeing outcomes that our members 59 bureaus across Scotland deliver, and also the client financial gain.
Alison, Charlie, no.
And the other panelists?
Oh, yep, thank you. Really pertinent question. As I said earlier, I think we have a fantastic opportunity to take forward the insight from the emergency protections around housing that the Scottish Government put in place. Just to pick on one of those, which is the continuing ban on eviction, I think we're understanding that that is playing a vital role in making sure that people do keep the roof over their head. But I think it gives us an opportunity to think about a more permanent change to how we deal with rent arrears. We do have an exceptional level of rent arrears coming. We need an exceptional response to that. A number of local authorities are looking very creatively at how they can offer some breathing space to tenants. But I think it's about recognising that, particularly with the progressive nature of the legislation that Scotland has, I think there's a strong argument which says pursuing evictions for rent arrears in the social sector could be seen as uneconomic. Evictions cost an awful lot of money for social housing providers to do. Often they're done for a relatively small amount of rent arrears. What is a better approach, given that in many cases local authorities will still have an ongoing duty to accommodate? I think one of the other pieces of learning that feels really important not to lose sight of is what local authorities have been doing to, as far as they can, increase the flow of accommodation to people coming through the homelessness system. We've seen local authorities dramatically increase the percentage of social lets being allocated to homeless households. In many areas, that's remained at well over 80% during the period of the pandemic. That is a dramatic increase from where it was before. When you go back to the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group recommendations of 3 years ago, the ambition around rapid rehousing, it was recognised then that the percentage of social lets being allocated to homeless households was absolutely of central importance if we're going to be serious about rapid rehousing. So how can we take that learning forward? How can we make sure that we sustain those fantastic increases in the percentage of social lets being allocated to homeless households?
Okay. Keith?
Yeah, just if I can just follow that point with Alison, and she's mentioned a number of times quite rightly, but the need to increase the supply of housing. One of the things which has changed going back to the financial environment is the imposition by the UK government of a unilateral 1% increase in Public Works Loans Board's interest rates. For example, that will cost your average local authority around £5 million more for primary school over the course of the 25 years they're paying for it. I just wonder if Alison's got any idea of the impact that has had on local authorities for building houses, whether it comes into the equation or not, and whether Shelter, or if she's aware of anybody else, have made representations on that, because it seems to be a direct tax on the building of infrastructure by local authorities.
It's not something we've got a particular evidence base on, Keith, but I'm very happy to look at whether we can furnish the committee with that at a later date. I think what we are aware of is that the Affordable Housing Supply Programme is probably one of the biggest success stories of the current Parliament. Now, obviously, the building programme was paused. I think it's urgent that as soon as it's safe to do so, can we see the Affordable Housing Programme going forward. But it's also about making sure that we don't think that that's job done, that we recognise that we are still making up for decades of underinvestment in social housing, and we need to see a long-term commitment to social housing that transcends parliamentary cycles and indeed transcends party politics. That is the single biggest thing that will make the single biggest difference in terms of that national ambition to end homelessness. You cannot end homelessness if you don't have enough homes to make sure that everyone in housing need gets the safe, affordable home that they need, that makes a difference to their lives.
Okay. All right, Keith.
Hey, last question, if I could, convener very briefly, just to say in relation to rent, and that I take on the points that Alison has made about evictions being uneconomic. You could also argue the rent system for many people is completely uneconomic, both for the people that are using it and for the local authorities and the government, we tend to shuffle rent monies between different rooms of the states at huge cost. And I just wonder whether for some people the idea of rent doesn't really work. The provision of safe, warm, modern accommodation without a more economic model to follow, and if you have any views on that.
Alison, you're muted.
Sorry. Oh.
Sorry.
Is that me back on? Brilliant, thank you very much. We've certainly seen a worrying direction of travel that social rents are increasing. We are very well aware that affordability in terms of rent levels in the private rented sector continues to be a very significant concern. We saw this morning, for example, the really compelling research from the Edinburgh Poverty Commission highlighting that 1 in 3 families in the capital who live in poverty, that's solely because of their housing costs. So I think there is a need to look at why are we allowing housing costs to continue to be such a strong driver of poverty when we have, quite rightly, high aspirations as a nation to end child poverty. So I think it is about unpacking, both in the social rented sector, how do we set rents? And how do we set rents in a way that is aligned to our national ambitions around what we want to see in terms of dialling down housing need and ending homelessness?
Okay, thank you, Keith. I like how you left the wee hand grenade till the very end.
Thank you very much, Convener, and welcome, panel. I wonder if I could follow Keith Brown's question about the experience over the last 6 months and lessons learned and what has gone well and could be sustained, but not in a specific way, but more in a generic way. So in other words, going forward, what do you think are the key attributes that we need to pay attention to in terms of a better relationship between local government, the voluntary sector, and dealing with the issues that all three of you are dealing with? So, for example, is it about flexibility? Is it about preventative spend? Is it about redesigning how services are delivered? What are the generic lessons that we should be learning? And perhaps I could just start with George and then Alison and then Charlie.
Hi, Andy. Thank you for the question. I think in terms of what lessons we could learn, I think there is opportunity with certainly pre the pandemic. We were hoping to submit as an organisation to Scottish Government our views around the local governance review that was ongoing at that point and has been postponed at the moment, around how we saw certainly a much different relationship with the voluntary sector, and especially our role, and an increasingly vital role in terms of how we could utilise what are often viewed as core services, but ultimately discretionary in nature for funding through councils, in a much more central and vital way to prevent the negative outcomes that we all know, homelessness being a particular example, cost more to fix later down the line than they do at the start. But as you know, the Christie aspect of the Christie Commission from over a decade ago was suggesting that it's that what mechanism do we put in place to enable there to be clearly more preventative actions to address that later failure demand. And I think that does involve a difference in how much greater the voluntary sector is embedded in public service delivery, especially across community planning partnerships with councils, and how they can deliver indeed more efficiently, especially in a context where there is such increase in demand for the types of services that our network of bureaus can deliver.
Alison?
Structural terms, the learning would have to be that the single biggest thing that we can do to prevent homelessness, increase the supply of affordable and social homes. I think in terms of other aspects of prevention, that our real learning point from the pandemic would be how do we recognise that health interventions can be an opportunity to engage with people in a different way and address the underlying issues that might lead to homelessness in the future. And I'm thinking here of the very comprehensive work that was done by Dr. Andrew Waugh, looking at linking data in health services to data in homelessness services. And his research highlighted that people have multiple touch points with health services before the first instance of homelessness. So if we can have a different set of questions being asked of people going through our health services, we have a very powerful opportunity there to increase the effectiveness of prevention way before the point of crisis. Delta Scotland's done some work in this area in the past, looking at how you can put housing advice services, debt prevention services in touch with primary care, picking up people who've got low-level anxiety, etc., who are less likely to engage with the letter coming through the box that says you're falling behind in your rent, and how can you then get a different intervention before that reaches a crisis point. And I think we have learned a great deal also from work that we've been doing with the NHS in Fife and Fife Housing Services, looking at people coming through the A&E department in the Victoria Hospital in Kirkcaldy, people who have a health crisis but are homeless, and working with clinical staff for people who have been flagged as being homeless, making sure that they don't become people who just keep coming back through that same system. So I think there's real opportunities to take that learning, both from interventions with primary care, but also with acute health care, to say what does different look like in terms of using those interventions as an opportunity to prevent homelessness.
Thank you, that's very, very useful. And Charlie?
Thanks. For the people with us, we go right back to aspirations and what do we actually hope as a country for their lives? Is it actually a career spent in social care and receiving social care, or can we actually envisage a different existence for people? I think a really, really critical point to move forward with. Also, I'm noticing so many of the responses from the different organisations. For us, it's about placing the person at the centre of the planning, the co-creation, co-production, listening to what they're really telling you about their hopes, dreams and ambitions, and how we limited resource, but how we might actually support them to realise that. I think self-directed support went some way to achieving that, and in some areas probably more than others. We should build on that. We've become a whole host of nations we can learn from in the last 6 months and build on. Use digital where it's appropriate, but also I go back to George's point, that face is such a fundamental for the society that we live in, and we need to find safe ways of building that in. Tell us about that, those people will learn, parents and carers. And that, I think, is the shift in perspective that we're really keen to see.
Thanks for that, Charlie.
Okay, thank you. Well, that was very, very. Thank you. That was very useful. And I'm just wondering if any of you also have reflections on what we can learn in relationship to supporting the most vulnerable people in society. For example, we saw quite a mobilisation around supporting those who had to shield during the pandemic. Now, in your experience, has that been basically just an emergency response, or have there been any lessons learned there about how to deal with the most vulnerable people? Maybe could ask George.
Right.
Or sorry, Charlie. Sorry, I think Charlie would like to come in. Charlie?
Yeah, no, I think the experience of shielding really varied for people, depending on the connections they may have had in the communities that they're in. So for some, they were able to get that additional support. We spent a significant amount of the pandemic linking people to the different voluntary schemes that have been set up where volunteers were taking food in, etc. How money became a significant issue for some people with learning disabilities. And for parents and carers, there was a sense that they were pretty much left alone for 24/7 caring responsibilities, where before there had been support provision. Having said that, I think actually the experience for everybody over the lockdown period probably enabled some people to see what life could be like with disabilities in a much more meaningful. We're all elements of isolation and loss, and that for so many people with learning disabilities is part and parcel of their ongoing life. So I think, again, at the time for it, I know we have to keep responding, but there's a priority in reflecting on the learning. What do we want to take with us, and what do we believe actually we could leave as part of that crisis response rather than learning from?
Very briefly, if there's any other contributors. George?
Convener, happy to answer Andy's question. I think, as I said earlier, the issue that really highlighted our lobbying to government for return to face-to-face was just how many people that we normally would see within the network who had ill health or who had a temporal or permanent vulnerability weren't there in the early weeks of the pandemic. It was a real concern to us, and what started our network and individual bureaus wanting us as a membership organisation to lobby for a return to face-to-face.
Okay, thank you. Alison?
I think one of the particular challenges that this highlighted was where people have a vulnerability and they're homeless and they're placed in temporary accommodation that is not of a standard that enabled people to safely self-isolate. We had people who were sharing kitchen facilities, sharing bathroom facilities, for example. That does not enable people to safely self-isolate. And I think it really highlights the urgent need to make sure that whilst people are in temporary accommodation, it's of a suitable standard. And anybody in temporary accommodation should expect accommodation of a suitable standard, which enables them to safely self-isolate if they need to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andy. I'm going to move on now to Gail. Gail Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Thanks for joining us. I come from the Highland region, and we see homelessness in remote rural areas in a slightly different way sometimes than is seen in urban areas, and we call it hidden homelessness. People that are not actually out on the streets as such, but are staying on friends' couches or in parents' houses. And I just wanted to know, first of all, from Alison, about the different challenges facing people in terms of homelessness in rural areas, and then from the other panellists about just challenges in general in remote rural areas. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question. Being a girl from the Highlands myself, I completely understand where you're coming from, quite literally. It's an area of work that Shelter Scotland's paid a lot of attention to over the years, recognising the very distinct challenges facing people who are experiencing homelessness in rural parts of Scotland. I absolutely agree, it becomes a more hidden problem. We've seen that when we've been working in areas like the Highlands, but also looking at the islands in Argyll and Bute, for example, same sort of sets of concerns. I think what we've needed to do as an organisation is think very carefully about how to make sure that we are accessible and relevant in terms of the support that we ourselves offer. And that's primarily through our digital channel and our telephone channel, because those are the ways that we can say, wherever you live in Scotland, you can access our help and advice free of charge. And that has to be very important. I think for us, it's also about reaching to relevant partners locally so that we understand the local situation and can also help build the capacity of those local partners if they themselves don't have all the expertise that they would want to have, all the information that they'd want to have on housing and homelessness, and making sure that that's available. But I think in terms of housing and homelessness and how that relates to the supply question, I think it's really clear to us that doing something about supply cannot simply be a numbers game. It has to be the right homes in the right places. And that recognises the ways that people want to live. It also recognises the opportunities to think about design, to think about energy efficiency, particularly in areas where actually getting oil is the way that you heat your house. So I think we have to make sure that we don't just take a blanket approach and saying, these are the houses that everyone gets in Scotland. That has to be a tailored approach, has to be right homes, right places.
Thank you.
George?
Nina, thank you. I think in terms of the challenges in remote areas, from a more broad perspective, the issues there are really accessibility to a bureau in the sense of our network, as I'm sure you're well aware. The likely travel distances to get face-to-face advice in the islands can be quite significant, even though we've got quite a few bureaus in the remote areas and remote rural areas of Scotland. The issue is balancing that, kind of having as much high quality information as we can on our public advice site and other channels of communication in, but also it's that ability to still have the outreach locations that are additional locations where we can deliver our advice even in a co-location setting with other services, and or just outreaches where, for example, the Bureau may staff for 2 hours, 1 day a week, and having all of those safe and secure is quite cost prohibitive in terms of the adaptations that will be needed in each of our locations. I think as a network we have certainly somewhere over 200 in terms of outreaches, if you combine that with our Bureau offices and annexes that are staffed for 1 or 2 days a week. All of those need to be safe and secure if those in remote areas are going to have that same level of access to face-to-face advice as those maybe in the more densely populated areas where they're close to a bureau who's already undertaken the risk assessment and those necessary changes physical environment. There may also be a tendency in more rural areas for our bureaus to be smaller and therefore going forward unable easily to have those kind of structural changes to enable safe social distancing for our rural citizens, if that's not a contradiction in terms.
Thank you.
Charlie?
Yep, thanks. Really good question. And again, it's the two sides of the one coin almost. I think in remote and rural areas, issues in relation to INS can be absolute. Some provide consistent support in terms of challenges of recruiting staff. How do you maybe work within the smaller communities in terms of actually looking for some volunteers, for example, some communities of support rather than maybe formal paid supports. However, where digital works, and I really don't want to be sounding completely negative about digital world, but where digital works, it's a positive boon in terms of connecting with people. I recently chaired a webinar on employment, and my co-presenter on that was a young man with a learning disability who lives in Nairn. It's been such a difficult situation operating. He's been travelling for 4 hours in a bus and multiple buses actually. All of those things now blown out of the way, and he spoke to 63 people about his life experience, and it was just such a really useful importance for everybody in that. So I think when those opportunities become, but also recognise where the weaknesses come, and I think is one of the really bits about working with the communities that do exist. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. I want to move on, convener. We've spoken a lot about the different issues that are facing members of the public. I want to speak about mental health support because I think that we're already seeing a stretched service and increased demand, and for a lot of people, losing your job, losing your home, it's devastating in terms of mental health. And George, I think you said you were dealing with extra calls up in the tens of thousands. So how are you signposting people to mental health services, and what do you think needs to happen in terms of extra funding, support, and services in that sense being put in place? That's for George, first of all.
Certainly in terms of if we've got, in terms of the helpline, resources in place for safeguarding, for dealing with those people who are vulnerable and perhaps having a mental health crisis at that particular point, so that they can be referred and managed accordingly within that context. In general terms as well, in terms of trying to give more and more advice and signposting online where we can, those people who have accessed our public advice site for particular aspects of support, maybe around redundancy or terms and conditions of employment, and making sure that there's wider advice there in terms of their mental well-being. I think also moving forwards as well in terms of how we actually evaluate outcomes from projects. I know there really needs to be quantitative KPI and indicators for funded projects, but also a recognition within the national performance framework of the wider and almost intangible impact that coming for support and advice. We regularly hear from our various projects that it's not only the client financial gain, it's having had your problem addressed and spoken to is almost unquantified in that financial aspect, because people feel better from that, feel that they've had a problem addressed where we've tried to help them with a particular part of advice. But the actual wider and more important offshoot from that interaction with one of our volunteer advisors is that they feel better about themselves and they aren't as low in terms of their own well-being after an interaction with one of our individual bureaus.
Gail, I'm going to have to finish that one there, I'm afraid. Okay, but that was the right person to speak to. Thanks very much. Annie?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. We've seen quite a lot of partnership working during the last 6 months at the start of the pandemic. And I was just wondering whether the witnesses could let me know if they support the move towards more partnership working and whether they believe that third sector funding is sufficient to make the most out of this approach. I'll ask Alison first, please.
I think it's very true to say that the pandemic has really brought partnership working very much to the fore and very, very quickly. Shelter Scotland's part of a collective of 29 different organisations who all have an interest in improving homelessness services. A collective called Everyone Home came together very quickly, shared data, shared intelligence, shared ideas about how we could improve things. And also there was a real commitment, and continues to be a real commitment, taking the learning about what we've seen be put in place regarding the emergency measures, but also taking forward the learning about how we work as partners. And we've also done a lot of work to reach out to other partners specifically on some of the issues we've been talking about this morning with regarding debt and people falling into rent arrears. Citizens Advice Scotland have been one of the partners that we've reached out to there. Because I think it is sharing data, sharing intelligence, getting a better idea of what the impact of the pandemic is so that we can plan together to take the right action on that. With regard to the part of your question about funding, I think there is a significant challenge there. George was talking earlier on about the volume of people coming forward looking for advice and support. It absolutely does exceed the capacity of the advice sector to reach everyone. For example, we run our national telephone helpline. On a good day, we're probably answering about 60% of the calls that come to us. We know that there's a vast number of people out there who are looking for advice and support who can't access it. And that was the position before the pandemic. So we are now more concerned about more unmet demand in the system. And I think something that recognises the extraordinary level of challenge that we're all facing as advice providers, as providers of support, and make sure that sufficient resources there to rise to that challenge is an essential part of how we need to go forward together.
Thanks, Alison. I don't know whether George wants to come in.
Annie, thank you very much. Certainly in terms of partnership working, we've been, as Alison was saying, trying to do more around the distribution articulation of our stats. So we've been trying to issue a stats pack on a regular basis to a range of stakeholders to enable that kind of sharing of what intelligence we're getting through our network, and also from an advocacy point of view, trying to use that to influence sort of positive change. I think we've recently been sharing that with councils and Skills Development Scotland and the Scottish Government through the Partnership Action for Continuing Employment, and trying to get more of our information into how those decisions are made and how that particular funding is used. I think there is a tendency for the voluntary sector to be seen as, especially one where there's so much of a volunteer-led network, who has additional capacity that doesn't necessarily get resourced to the same extent, especially when there's additional funding being made available. And we are efficient, we can deliver the outcomes that are required, we can collaborate with the delivery of public services, and that's really within the ethos and vision of the National Performance Framework. So I think if something comes out of this pandemic, it demonstrates just how public and voluntary sector can work together, but maybe how we need to take a different approach to the funding of that going forwards. I know it's unhelpful for councils in terms of their best value duties, that they have to concentrate on statutory functions first, and quite a lot of the voluntary sector's functions, while seen as core services by those councils, aren't statutory. So when it comes to their audit process, they need to look at their statutory services first. So that really says something maybe around whether we need greater statutory recognition for great work that all the voluntary sector does in contributing to those national outcomes.
Thanks very much. Charlie, I've got a slightly different question for yourself, but sort of on the same theme. One of the suggestions put forward by SCLD was that this could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to bring about change in the voluntary sector. And I was just wondering whether you could expand on that, about what the future of the voluntary sector might look like, what you were sort of going on there.
Absolutely on that. I think it does absolutely, question in terms of partnership is everything. I think what the last 6 months have shown us is an ability for the voluntary and community sector, and I think there's slightly different things, but voluntary community sector, set aside any sense of competition. Partnership is so much based on value, inspiration, partnership with individuals, for example, the young man I was speaking about in there, right through to the Scottish Government and everything in between. It is absolutely, I believe, the way that we can have the biggest impact on people's lives. And I think sustainable funding for the sector is really critical, not necessarily to deliver the partnerships or values or aspiration, but to ensure that the consistency of the work can continue. And I think there are real challenges in there. However, I think what we are able to demonstrate over the last 6 months is the flexibility, going back to a point made earlier, the adaptability, the sector and its willingness to put people at the heart of everything it does. I think that gives us such a strong foundation to build forward. Thank you.
Annie?
Thanks very much, Convener. That's me. I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that then. In that case, that completes our questions and concludes our evidence session with our first panel. Thanks everyone for taking part, and I now suspend the meeting for a panel changeover. There'll be a brief suspension, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, and I'm pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses who are attending remotely today. They are Joanna Baxter, Head of Local Government Bargaining, Unison; Callum Humchuk, National Director, Chartered Institute of Housing; Kirsten Hogg, Head of Policy, Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisation. I am grateful for you taking time to answer our questions today. We've again allocated just over an hour for this session, and as I said to the last panel, there's no need for panellists to give a full answer if your views are generally in line with points already made. They allow us to cover more themes during the session. Members will again ask their questions in a pre-arranged order, with any supplementaries taken at the end if time allows. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to. Please could everyone give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. And I'll now move on to the questions from members as before, beginning with myself. Could you maybe highlight for me the areas of service provision which were under most pressure before the pandemic and whether this has changed in any way? And I'm happy to take questions from Kirsten.
Absolutely. As the previous panel says, exacerbated and shone a light on the issues which were already there. So in particularly, we would highlight the issues around the sustainability of voluntary sector funding. Those issues have been highlighted in many reports over the years, most recently by the Equalities and Human Rights Committee in their pre-budget scrutiny last year. And what we found during the crisis is that these issues have really come to a head in a way which is very public, but which perhaps to those of us in the sector isn't any great surprise. And so what we think it's really important to learn from that is that while the emergency funding to the sector has been incredibly helpful and incredibly useful, that has to be seen almost as a second plaster to deal with the immediate crisis situation. And we have to go back always to the issues which were present before the crisis when we want to think about sustainability going forward. So absolutely there are lessons that we can learn from the way that things panned out during the crisis, but we also can't forget the situation that was there before.
Okay, thank you for that. Joanna, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I think it is important to say that we can't really evaluate the impact of the pandemic without understanding the position local government was in before the pandemic struck. This is a sector that has, over the last 10 years, seen £2 billion worth of efficiencies taken out of the system. And when I say efficiencies, those are real jobs of our members and people who would contribute to the local economy. In this financial year, £205 million real terms cut to local government revenue funding, and we've seen an increase in ring fencing to local government finance such that in this financial year 61% of local government funding is ring fenced for Scottish Government priorities, which means that cuts have disproportionately fallen on other service areas in the area of discretionary spend that local government can control. And what we've seen pre-pandemic is, in terms of pressure, on our social care services, education support staff, our cleaners, environmental health officers, exactly the people that have been required to keep our country going throughout the period of the pandemic. They are under massive pressure right now, and certainly with Brexit coming round the corner as well, the pressure on environmental health officers is only going to increase. And so the ability for local government to control its own budget is fundamental in terms of ensuring that they can put investment into the service areas that need it most.
Okay, I'm sure the issue of ring fencing will come up probably at sometime during this, because there are kind of disputes about how much flexibility local governments have. But Callum, would you like to come in at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Yeah, so I mean, as you've heard from the previous panel and other witnesses here, local authority housing and homelessness services have been absolutely the forefront of the pandemic. But really helpfully, the Scottish Housing Regulators kind of mapped the performance of all social landlords. So we've really got some kind of clear data about the kind of pressure on the services. Back in April, we had a little under 2,300 applications for homeless services. The most recent data set from August was at a little under 3,000. So 700 more monthly applications in that time. But we also know that actually there's a huge downward pressure on homelessness applications due to the eviction protections and the furlough scheme. I think we're finding that we're seeing that artificially low. Back in 2018-19, we're usually seeing 178 homes recovered from the social sector per month. In the last 3 months, there's been a total of 30. So you can see the policies in place are keeping homelessness applications down. But actually, as the furlough scheme ends and the eviction scheme comes to an end at some point in the future, and there's no absolute date on that, we are likely to see a big impact on services. Very much linked to that, though, is the impact on temporary accommodation. We had from the previous session talked about partnership working. We saw a huge effort to get people off the street and into as safe as possible accommodation as a consequence of the pandemic, and that meant for the most part put people in temporary accommodation. The extra steps that were put in place to ensure that properties were lettable were onerous, and we put more and more people in temporary accommodation. That was right at the time, but we've now got over 14,000 households in temporary accommodation. The big challenge for local authorities is how do we move people into a permanent settled accommodation, and to kind of echo again what the previous panel mentioned from Alison Watson, that means investing in more social and affordable homes in Scotland.
Okay, thank you for that, Carl. I wonder if any could tell me where do you think staff working in particular areas of your service have been more heavily impacted than others during this pandemic? Anybody particular? Joanna?
Our members in social care have been on the front line of the response to the pandemic under very difficult circumstances. But also our cleaners in educational establishments in terms of the preparation for education recovery have been under incredible pressure, and there simply are not enough of them. We're seeing local authorities having to recruit cleaners in all areas of the country. Those are one of the service areas that have been hit over previous years of austerity, and they really are vital to ensure that education establishments are COVID safe, but also our education support staff who are not just a support to teachers in schools, but actually help with the education of our children in their role. Those particularly looking after children with additional support needs. And also I would say child protection officers, social workers who have been looking after the most vulnerable in our community during the period of COVID in very difficult circumstances. So I think those are some of the key areas where we've seen additional pressure, but obviously we've had members in all service areas of local authorities really stretched capacity during the period of the pandemic, whether they've been on the front line or working from home.
Can I ask, I'm going to ask you, Joanna, and then the two questions will be asked to the others, but do you think that the staff have been effectively supported in performing their job in a new way, for example, working from home or having to adjust working with PPE?
Well, I mean, there were certainly a huge number of issues with regards to PPE at the beginning of the pandemic. Some of those have eased, but some remain. We saw members at the start of the pandemic being told that they didn't need certain PPE provisions, and really having to challenge their employers to make sure that actually they were given the equipment that they needed to be safe. We have recruited a huge number of health and safety reps to assist our members in ensuring that their workplaces are COVID safe. And there has been good joint working with many authorities in terms of risk assessments of working establishments, but those have not been consistent always, and I think that's a nature of the way local government is organised. We have worked very closely with COSLA to ensure that we are issuing guidance to local authorities on how staff should be supported during the period of the pandemic, whether that's about provision of equipment for those who are home working or those who are on the front line. We did a recent piece of work with COSLA on ensuring that people who may be suffering from mental health issues as a result of the pandemic are reassured that they've got support that they can access. But as I say, how those things are applied at a local level vary quite considerably across the piece. There have been really excellent examples in some authorities. Inverclyde, for example, are providing vouchers for employees to get flu vaccinations, which is going to be really important as winter approaches. But in other areas, we have seen authorities that have been very resistant to forms of support. And one example of that would be in terms of home working allowances. They're very slow sometimes to meet the expenses that members have had to incur in purchasing equipment. Not very helpful in explaining the HMRC £6 a week that can be claimed, or indeed paying that directly. The difficulty with that allowance is that if individuals claim it directly from the HMRC, they enter into a period of self-assessment, which many low and vulnerable workers are not confident in accessing. So that is a real concern, because it actually means that many of our members are not claiming that, not getting what they're entitled to from the government, and their employer refusing to pay it to them directly, which is provided for within the rules.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Kirsten, Callum, anything you'd like to add to that? Yes.
The sector in Scotland, the voluntary sector, employs over 100,000 people and mobilises 1.4 million volunteers, so this is a really significant issue for us. But because of the breadth of different supports and services and ways of working that the voluntary sector has, there have really been two extremes in the ways that people have been impacted who are employed by the sector. So we've seen very large numbers of people on furlough, or volunteers unable to do the volunteering that they would previously have done, and there are mental health implications as well as financial implications of all of that for everyone involved. But at the other extreme, we've seen a large number of organisations where staff on the front line, because of their relationships with the people that they work with, because they're in those jobs, because they want to help people, have flexed their organisations to do what was immediately needed during the crisis. But with that flex also comes some stretch, and that flex is not sustainable over the long term. So while it was great that organisations were able to adapt what they do, so organisations who became involved in food distribution and the like, when that's not what they would traditionally do with those people. It's super to step in and fill that gap, and people did it because they wanted to and because it needed to be done. But that's not a sustainable way of working over the long term, and we need to now be looking at what's needed going forward and what we can learn from that. Mental health is an issue which in particular we're picking up through the published research that's coming out of the sector. So our most recent summary of the research which has come out between, I believe it's June and August, highlighted mental health both for the people that are supported by voluntary organisations, but also for staff as a real key concern coming forward from voluntary organisations. In terms of the support that's been available to people, I think that word support during a crisis is really wide-ranging and can involve a lot of different things. So SCVO has been concentrating a lot on the digital support to people and organisations, and that very sort of practical level support. I know that some of my colleagues who work in the social care sector would say that the issues that were just highlighted there around access to PPE were ripped even larger for voluntary organisations who felt like they came down the pecking order in the immediate provision of PPE. I think what's really important is that we all look now at what we need to do to support staff at this point, it doesn't feel like an immediate crisis, but people are being asked to work in a different way. There's an impact on them, on their day-to-day lives and on the way that they do their work and with the people that they work with. So particularly as we move from a health crisis into an economic crisis and people are being asked to work with people who are in even more and more difficult situations, we need to really remain mindful of the impact of that on the people that we employ as well as the people that we support.
Okay, thank you for that. Callum, I'm going to have to move on and hopefully you'll get the chance to answer those questions during the other session, the other questions. But Sarah, will you come in at the stage, please?
Thank you very much, Convener. Yes, I want to pick up the issue about the funding position that our councils are in terms of their capacity to provide services. And I wanted to pick up on 2 points in relation to reduced income and the impact that was having. First of all, I would like to ask Joanna Baxter, you talked about the backdrop of local government funding, but the current issue in terms of ALIOs and local authorities having to put funding into ALIOs to keep them going, given the importance in terms of health and well-being of our constituents and the big issue of jobs. So I wondered if you wanted to comment about specific issues in terms of culture and sports ALIOs to start off. Thank you.
With regards to ALIOs is really concerning at the moment. Whilst we've seen a number of local authorities a number of local authorities have furloughed directly employed staff, we have seen that the vast majority of ALIO staff have been furloughed during the period of the pandemic, and that's because obviously their services could not operate. Culture and leisure facilities were restricted, and some of them have only just come back online. So many of those staff have been furloughed for a long period of time, and in terms of trying to protect those workers, obviously we tried to negotiate with ALIOs to ensure that their wages were topped up to their usual amount rather than the statutory furlough compensation. And most of that funding has come from the local authorities. So there's been some cost attached to that, but also we've seen obviously the income for ALIOs fall through the floor during the period of the pandemic because their services have been closed. And I think this is a real area of concern for us because whilst ALIOs are arm's length organisations, local authorities do still have relationships with them. They are their biggest funder and in many areas are associated employers, and therefore the buck stops with the local authority really in terms of employment law liabilities and equal pay. So we understand the estimated total cost to the ALIOs is around £121 million. That's taken from the UK Culture and Leisure Trust organisation. It may be much larger than that because obviously all of those services have not yet come back on board and they will take some time to do so as restrictions remain. So the staff in ALIOs are extremely vulnerable. One thing that we said when the furlough scheme got underway was that furlough should not be a waiting room for redundancy, and that statement remains today. What we have seen, though, is those workers who have been furloughed trying to volunteer in their communities in terms of helping local authorities in other ways. But the situation with regards to financial exposure in ALIOs is very acute. And so when you're looking at local government finance as a whole, you can't do so without also looking into the situation for their arm's length organisations.
Thanks, that's very useful. I want to develop the point about reduced income with Callum Chumsock. I'm particularly thinking about the impact of rental income, which has been mentioned by several people in the last discussion we had, and the impact on homelessness. We were talking about the issue of rent arrears. So Callum, I was wondering if you have a comment you would want to make about the impact on provision of services and also the viability of housing services going forward in terms of provision of services to tenants. And then the other issue is the capital side, where I raised the issue of a potential real terms cut of 30% in terms of the social housing programme. So given the vulnerability of finances, I wondered if you'd comment on both those issues.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think that's a real. So I mentioned at the outset that the eviction protections came in and they've helped maintain a kind of cap on homelessness, and that is welcome. I think that was the absolute right thing to do. But the impact has been an increase in rent arrears. We saw rent arrears in the local authority sector increase by £12 million over the last 4 or 5 months. That is significant. Local authorities are now managing over £100 million of rent arrears. For every pound that we don't raise in rent, that's a pound that we can't use to keep rents low. That's a pound that we can't use to improve services. That's a pound that we can't use to actually build new homes. So £100 million is a significant impact on local authority services that they are going to have to manage. I think the long term, we need to consider long term the kind of sustainability of the eviction protections and how the sector comes out of that. There is a concern around the culture of non-payment amongst those who can pay but choose not to pay. I'm not saying that is common, but there are examples of that from a number of landlords. So it's something we really need to consider. But I think that the point you make around capital spend is incredibly important, Sarah. I think we know that local authorities have a significant degree of housing debt over the last number of years. I think there's around £3.8 billion worth of housing debt amongst local authorities. That's up £225 million in the last year where we have data. That debt has been increased because they're building homes, because we're building 50,000 affordable homes, and that's absolutely appropriate and right that local authorities take on that debt. The draft report last week, the draft infrastructure investment plans suggest that there'll be a significant cut to the social and affordable housing budget. So we're spending around £3.6 billion this Parliament on social and affordable housing. The indicative draft budget set puts us out £2.8 billion. That's around 30% real terms cut, as I believe you mentioned in the chamber yesterday, Sarah. I think from our calculations, that would, based on grant rates remaining the same, we'd probably see a 20% cut. So instead of 50,000 affordable homes, we'll be looking at 40,000 affordable homes. Everything we've heard already around the pressure that was coming on homelessness, the rise in temporary accommodation, and we have concerns about whether this budget will meet the challenge that local authorities are facing and will continue to face, particularly over the next few years in responding to the pandemic.
So that's really an issue in terms both of provision of existing homes and services, but also in terms of new homes. So your argument that you think more investment needs to go into both sides, because we had a very difficult discussion last week about the issue of unsuitable accommodation, and as Alison from Shelter said, the issue of rationing in terms of lack of affordable housing. And the fact a 10% rise in homelessness, I think the statistic was today.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more obligations come onto local authorities as well. We have, come January, we're about to see a narrowing of what accommodation can be used to house people in temporary accommodation. That's right. We don't want to see anybody in inappropriate and unsuitable accommodation. That's the housing sector agrees with the kind of the premise of that, but we can't simply eradicate homelessness by changing policies. We need to see the appropriate investment in that. So I think when we're looking at the kind of lessons to come from the kind of pandemic, part of it is absolutely we need to fund the policies that we believe in. We all quite rightly took the right approach to protect people at the height of the pandemic, get them off the street, put them into temporary accommodation. That was the right thing to do. We need to think about the next step and looking at the capital budget as is the draft budget doesn't, from our perspective, meet the challenge that we're going to have over the next few years in Scotland when it comes to addressing the housing and homelessness crisis.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to on. Okay, thank you, Annie.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. I would just like to touch on partnership working and whether you could talk about your experiences that you have had with partnership and community working with councils during the pandemic. Probably Kirsten, for you first on this one, please.
Of course. So I think it's important to highlight that the examples of good practice of partnership working that we've highlighted in our submission and that I'm going to talk about and that we can learn from are not universal experiences. So it's not absolutely the case that this meant everything worked really smoothly in terms of partnership working, but there are nonetheless some really good examples and a range of different things that I think we can learn from. There are, at a national level, we achieved really significant things in partnership, and I think it's important to recognise that some of those partnerships were local government and Scottish Government and voluntary sector and private sector and a whole range of people pulling together to achieve things that would have never otherwise seemed possible. So we've heard a lot today about the remaining crises in housing, and they're absolutely right. But for 14 days we eradicated rough sleeping, which is something that we never ever thought would have been possible. Now that in itself is not enough, and we know that, but there must be things that we can learn from the art of the possible which appeared during the crisis. And for voluntary organisations, I think we saw a few things. We saw a greater degree of flexibility in those partnerships. So particularly from funding partners, we were encouraged to just go on and do what needed to be done to meet that immediate need. And what we're seeing from the independent funders at this point is a real period of reflection about how can we continue that, what can we learn from that, and how can we continue to incorporate that flexibility into our funding. While anecdotal evidence suggests that statutory funders are retreating into a more sort of command and control traditional relationship with those organisations that they fund. So I think there's some considerable learning to be had there. But it's important also, I think, to remember that those partnership examples which worked really well has a focus on outcomes. So the letter that the Cabinet Secretary wrote to the committee around the provision of emergency funding I found really interesting because it was structured in two ways. One was, this is the money that we've given to these organisations, so this is the money that we've given to local government, and this is the money that we've given to the voluntary sector. But it also highlighted two areas around food distribution and digital exclusion, where there was a focus on what it was we needed to achieve. And there's no surprise to me there that they are the areas, a couple of the areas that I would highlight where there has been really strong partnership working, where we were really focused and all pulling together on what is it that we need to achieve rather than worrying about who was doing it. But the very last thing to say from a voluntary sector point of view is that partnership doesn't always have to mean you need to give us money. So some of the examples that we've highlighted in our written submission are around occasions where actually it was the voluntary sector who were bringing the financial resource to the table that they were able to access in different ways. But by working in partnership with local government and other partners, they were able to, for example, identify the people who are most in need, or identify the people who just missed the threshold for a statutory intervention, but the voluntary sector, by working in partnership, were able to come in and pick that up. So partnership doesn't always have to mean that we're also coming asking for money.
I don't know if any other panel member would like to just add anything to that. Callum.
Yeah. Thanks, Annie. Yeah, in the housing and homelessness sector, actually, we have a kind of really strong vehicle for partnership working to address homelessness, which are rapid rehousing transition plans. And that has worked really well. Local authorities working with housing associations to actually mobilise the entire sector to actually address homelessness. And what we found over the course of the pandemic, as we were dealing with the crisis of how we get people off the street, we found housing associations working with local authorities and giving them their properties to use for temporary accommodation. And I think that was we heard from Alison earlier around kind of 80-90% of less. And I think that was a really good example of the sector actually working together and as Kirsten's talked about, seeing there's a problem and actually addressing it straight on. So there are, I think the relationships certainly in the housing and homeless sector are there. But back to my earlier point, is to ensure they are sustainable and long term, it requires funding and it does require more social and affordable homes.
Thank you for that. Just on a sort of a broader sort of a question as well, do you see that the way councils operate, particularly how they support communities, changing in the long term as a result of the pandemic, and how the Scottish Government might support this going forward? Joanna, maybe?
Yes, thank you, Annie. I mean, I do think that the pandemic has thrown up a number of issues in terms of how councils operate. There really has to be greater joint working with health and social care partners, and obviously that's subject to other discussions. But I also think we need to ensure that councils are at the forefront of the economic recovery. They are one of the anchor employers in many areas, and so it absolutely makes sense that they are empowered and at the forefront of that recovery through developing new income streams, establishing, for example, municipally owned bus companies, the establishment of community investment banks, and enabling the transition to green energy. So there's a number of things that can be done, but they don't replace, I think, the fundamental need for more funding and more authority and discretion over the funding that they do have that comes from the Scottish Government. Because the financial crisis that local government is now in is of a scale that we have never seen before. If you take into account the financial gap before the pandemic hit, £205 million at the start of the financial year, COSLA estimated the cost of the pandemic in June at £739 million, and then the cost of the pandemic to our ALIOs of £121 million. We are looking at £1 billion, circa £1 billion budget gap to Scottish local government. That does require long-term financial stability from the Scottish Government, longer-term planning, greater discretion for local authorities in terms of their areas of spend, but it will also mean that there does need to be some flexibility for local government to create those new income streams, but they need the investment to do that. And certainly, I think one thing that has come through very strongly during the period of the pandemic is that the roles that are some of the lowest paid in local government have demonstrated themselves to be the most essential that we rely on for to keep our country running. The cleaners and the social care workers, the education support workers, they're the hidden heroes of this pandemic. So financial investment which recognises their massive contribution to keeping our country going has to be at the heart of the economic recovery.
Okay. Right. Okay, Annie, I'm afraid I'm going to have to move on. All right. Thank you. Gail?
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to start off by asking Joanna Baxter about the ring fencing for local authorities. I've had a wee look, and obviously things like Gaelic, PEF funding, early learning and childcare are ring fenced because the government sees these as a priority. Joanna, do you have any other examples of what exactly is ring fenced? Because you did reference the 61% figure that COSLA put forward in your written submission. And of the ring fenced funding, what would you like to see opened up that you can use, that local authorities could use for other purposes?
So thanks for your question. So the increased amount of funding that has become ring-fenced has increased over a period of time. So the current areas of ring fencing would be things like education, health and social care, and they're getting increased protection from the Scottish Government. I don't think anybody would dispute that those are priorities, but the way in which local authorities could deliver them may be local authorities may have different ideas about how they could be delivered locally better. I think what that means is that the areas that are not ring-fenced, roads and transport, finance, HR, finance, IT, which will be vital for any expansion of digital post the pandemic, culture and leisure, economic development planning and regulatory services. So those are the areas that have absolutely been hit hardest through the cuts that have taken place over the previous decade. And those areas really do need investment going forward. If you look at, for example, the pressures that will come with winter, with the pandemic still in existence, our roads maintenance workers, our gritters, those will all need further investment, and also the cleaners in schools that are currently requiring additional investment. That pressure will continue, and when Brexit arrives, the pressure that will come to bear on environmental health officers who are not currently under ring-fence protection, they will also need greater investment, and we'll need to recruit more of them. So those are a few examples I can give you just now.
Joanna, can I ask that you cut your answers down a bit, because we've got a lot to get through. Thank you. Gail?
Thanks, convener. So just on that point, Joanna, if I can just come back to you for a quick question and answer. Thanks, convener. Would you like to see, you mentioned there just now environmental services, would you like to see some of the funding that's ring-fenced, not ring-fenced, and other funding that's currently not ring-fenced, ring-fenced?
I think, and I'll try and keep it short, this is not just about how we slice up the pie, it's about the size of the pie. There needs to be a bigger pie, i.e. there needs to be a bigger pot of money. This is not just about taking from one area and giving it to another. It's about bigger financial investment from the Scottish Government into local authorities.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to go to Kirsten Hogg, if I may. She mentioned in one of her previous answers about support for mental health. And of course, it's not just the service users, as she rightly pointed out, it's the staff and volunteers as well that need that support. Is there adequate support for mental health issues for staff and volunteers, Kirsten?
I don't know that I'm pleased to answer that. I can say that it's been certainly identified as an issue by organisations within the voluntary sector. They're highlighting concerns around it, which I suppose suggests that at this point either there isn't support available or people don't know how to access it. But from an STVO point of view, we haven't looked into that at this stage. That just became apparent from looking at the research in the last quarter, so it's a new finding for us.
Thanks. To go back to Joanna again, is that something that you've been hearing from your members at all?
Sorry, I struggled to grasp what the colleague was saying there. I didn't hear her.
Just about mental health support, and you know, it's a really difficult time, not just for service users, but for the staff that are providing these services as well.
It's a massive issue for our members, and they've been under a huge amount of pressure from the start of the pandemic, which is why we did that joint piece of work with COSLA recently on Don't Stay on Mute. There is support available. We're seeing that coming to bear really though on staff on a daily basis, and it's not a situation that can continue in the long term.
Okay, thank you. And the same question that I asked the first panel, I'm going to ask Callum about housing in rural areas and homeless in rural areas, if he has any points of view on that.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. So we've certainly, part of the kind of work CIH has been working on the last few years has really been looking at the issue of domestic abuse. And actually, I picked up the question you mentioned, Alison, around the scale of hidden homelessness. And we know that victims of domestic abuse are particularly prevalent amongst those who are the hidden homelessness, those who haven't yet left the home with the perpetrator and are unwilling or unable to access services. We also know that in the Highlands, as well as the kind of cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, actually access to refuge provision is incredibly difficult. It's, you know, across the country, only 1 in 6 homeless applicants get access to refuge. Once you're in a refuge in kind of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and the Highlands, you often been there for up to 18 months. There are huge challenges around the kind of once the scale of hidden homelessness, and then actually once someone's able to access victims of domestic abuse, able to access appropriate services, getting them into a refuge and then out of it, because the refuges are incredibly important, but they aren't supposed to be there for kind of long-term support. And it comes back to the thing I keep saying is around that actually we need to be able to transition people into permanent settled accommodation at a place where, as Alison Watson said, in a place where they want to live, where they feel that kind of connection with their family and their friends, and where they feel supportive. And that's a huge challenge. And I think, particularly in the kind of Highlands, you may have a large area and their supply will not be as concentrated in some areas. It limits the options. We need local authorities, Scottish Government, RSLs need to work collectively to understand where people want to live, and provide that accommodation for them.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, convener. It's me.
Okay, thank you very much, Gail. Andy?
Thank you very much, convener, and welcome to the panel. I just want to open with asking the same question I asked the first panel, which is what generic lessons can we learn in terms of delivering services better, that are more responsive to users, more cost-effective, etc. as well, from the pandemic? In other words, going beyond emergency responses. And in particular, have we learned any lessons about how to deliver preventative spending in any of the areas you're involved in?
Kirsten.
Yeah, so for us, this is about how we combine what we've learned from the pandemic with what we knew before. So during the pandemic, as I've said, particularly around funding, we experienced a greater flexibility around what money could be spent on, and a pulling together around a focus on outcomes and just getting the job done, accompanied by a lack of bureaucracy. Often there are very, very many hoops that voluntary organisations are required to jump through in order to get funding, and it felt like during the pandemic some of that art of the possible stuff appeared, and we all pulled together to get the job done. And it would be absolutely great if we can sort of unpick some of that. Why did that feel possible in a crisis situation, and why does it feel less possible with some public sector funders at this point? But I think it's also really important to recognise the things that we knew before and combine that with the learning that we've had from the pandemic. So arguably part of the reason that things worked so well during the pandemic was that we stopped just focusing on the power dynamics, I suppose, slightly disappeared. It was more about what is it that we need to do rather than who holds the purse strings. And so that relationship-based commissioning, that outcomes-based commissioning, I think is something that we should be looking to carry forward. And that ties into the things that we already knew. So the advisory group on economic recovery, for example, in picking up things post-crisis, has talked about longer-term funding for the voluntary sector, about strategic commissioning, and about the involvement of the private sector in those partnerships as well. And I think that they are really important lessons, but they're also really important lessons which were flagged in 2019 by the Equalities and Human Rights Committee in their pre-budget report, and they noted that they'd flagged them previously in 2016. So some of this is about what we learned about what's possible during the crisis, but it's also starting to answer some of the questions that we know have been there for a very long time about structurally how the voluntary sector is funded, and if we are to play our key role going forward as we move into the economic crisis, and hopefully at some stage out of the health-based crisis, then that's going to be really important to take both things into account.
Thank you very much. Jana, do you have any observations?
Thanks. I think there's a number of issues, lessons that we can learn. Firstly, in terms of the flexibility of the local government workforce, I think they've demonstrated themselves to be extremely flexible. I think that going forward in terms of maintaining a work-life balance, some people might want to work from home in the future, some people may not, but what we know now is that it is possible. And I think really the value of giving workers an effective voice, because trade unions have been key in the discussions about ensuring workplaces return safely. Our health and safety reps have worked with employers across the country, and I know that both sides have really valued that expertise. And I think also cooperation between local authorities in terms of service provision and filling gaps. And I think if you look at, for example, the establishment of temporary mortuaries where workers were being pulled from different local authorities to staff those establishments, the cooperation between local authorities was stark.
Okay, thank you. And Callum, do you have any observations on that in the housing sector?
I think very similar to the other contributors. I think the kind of partnership working and the sort of setting aside the egos, if you want, and actually focusing on the outcome has been really quite inspiring. Actually, I think it's worked very, very effectively, and actually ensuring people are getting off the street and the kind of institutional barriers where we're being addressed. And how do we structurally embed that into the future? Again, reflecting on earlier comments around prevention, the almost 10-year anniversary of Christie Commission, how do we embed that approach to prevention? One of the recommendations from the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group was putting a prevention duty on public bodies to prevent homelessness. That may be a really kind of institutional way of actually ensuring that it isn't just local authorities, but actually health and other services that people engage with actually have a responsibility to prevent homelessness. So because we know if we can address homelessness before it starts, before it's exacerbated, actually it's not a better outcome, but it's better financially. But I think for me the biggest lesson around what we learn from this is around we need to fund services that we believe in. We put in place the policies and the legislative frameworks, but unless it's matched with the money required, we are ultimately going to fall short. I think we've worked in a crisis situation over the last 6 months. I think we saw all the public sector and public services really rally round and do whatever they can. There is a point this will fall apart without the appropriate money coming through from the government and local government.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, those are some important points from Kirsten on focusing on outcomes and greater flexibility, flexible working from Johanna, workers' voice, etc. I should encourage you all to make sure those lessons are well articulated, because as you will well be aware, there'll be a risk that we continue to focus on the short term and lose sight of some more fundamental reforms we might need. I just want to come back to Kirsten on the voluntary sector. You mentioned the advisory group and the economic recovery report and the Equalities and Human Rights Committee report in November 2019. In your evidence, you say that the recommendations of that recent inquiry should be acknowledged and responded to by the Scottish Government in full. Now, I'm aware, I think that inquiry was part of pre-budget scrutiny, so in a sense the response that came back from government, which I looked at very briefly, was a little bit cursory. I mean, what in particular are you looking for? And is there any signs that Scottish Government is going to respond more fully to the recommendations of the committee?
I'm not aware if they are intending to make a full response to the specific recommendations of the committee. However, in the Scottish Government's response to the advisory group on economic recovery, they have committed to what I believe is phrased as strengthening collaboration between the voluntary sector and local authorities and Scottish Government. We are in the very early stages of unpicking with them what that might mean, but what I very much hope that might mean is that will address some of those recommendations from both of those reports that I've mentioned, so that it would start to look at longer term funding for the sector. The Scottish Government in the Programme for Government restated its commitment to longer term funding, but we don't see a huge amount of evidence of that on the ground. So we hope that we'll be able to unpick some of that. We hope we'll be able to include conversations around strategic commissioning, around what procurement of services should look like, not having competition by default, around that partnership approach. But also, very importantly, I think around core funding for the sector, because what the COVID crisis has really shown us is that very many organisations, because they're not always able to secure core funding and they instead are funded on a very short-term basis for projects, that means that when a crisis does hit, very many of them are not in a financial position to weather that storm without outside support. And so those are very big issues. There are systems change issues in a lot of cases. They play to the conversations that I referenced in my separate answer about power dynamics between all three of those actors, the Scottish Government and local government and the voluntary sector. I think if we don't start to have those conversations now, in the face of understanding the incredibly important role that the sector played in the crisis, but also the really difficult situation that it found itself in, then we may never have them. So the previous panel talked about this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have those conversations, and I think it is, but I think it's also an opportunity that's been 15 years in the making. We've known these things for a long time, and now's the time to act on them.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy, I'm going to have to finish off there. Okay, thank you very much. Keith?
Thanks, Convener. Can I first of all say thank you to the panel for coming along, and also especially to local government employees, thank you for the work they've done. I know that in my area there's been some extraordinary effort gone into by people in Stirling Clackmannanshire councils, so thanks for that.
Okay, Keith seems to have fallen off. I wonder if what we could do in the interim is... Oh, you're back, Keith? Right, okay. Okay.
The weight of the rain that's falling just now, but just to say, I was really surprised by the figure of 61% that Unison gave for ring-fenced funding. That really surprised me. I just wonder if it's possible for Joanna to give us just a kind of sketchy overview of what comprises that 61% of all local government funding that's now ring-fenced.
Our members who have been working so hard. In terms of ring-fence funding, most of that is education, social work services, health and social care. The areas that are not ring-fenced would be buses, paths, roads, planning, community learning events, sport and leisure, libraries, tourism, business support, environmental health and trading standards. So those are COSLA's own figures, but our understanding from previous documentation is that figure has simply increased year on year over the last decade, and it's currently 61% protected.
You in, Keith? Callum.
Sorry, just to add to that, so it's important to note that the housing revenue account for the construction of social houses is also ring-fenced, so the money that comes in to local authorities to actually build and manage, so the management of the building of the homes, tenants' rents, the housing debt that's accrued is all separate from the kind of general spend, which will be kind of put on homelessness, for example.
Are you back, Keith? No, well, I'll ask a question in the interim then, round about the ring fencing. Is this right? Okay, Keith, on you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't get any of that answer, but obviously there's the official report, so I'll check up on that, Convener. My other question, I suppose, was again for Unison and for Callum, which was around the previous question I asked. The Unison submission that we received talks about building the infrastructure, and obviously Callum has mentioned the burden of arrears on local authorities. The Public Works Loans Board, though, is a supplier of finance for infrastructure in local government and for housing, and that has been increased by 1%, which is a massive tax on new infrastructure building by local authorities in relation to housing as well. I wonder if either of organisations have made representations or has any views on the impact of that increase, a 1% increase in the interest rate that's paid, or if they can even understand why this has come about during a time of extremely low interest rates. Perhaps Callum and then Joanna.
Thanks. Unfortunately, no, we haven't had any kind of representations on the kind of scale of this increase regarding the impact of social and affordable home building. But I think your point, anything that undermines or makes it more challenging to build the affordable homes that we need is it's not helpful to the current housing crisis. We've got a number of challenges that are kind of mentioned around the level of arrears, the level of housing debt, and increased demand we're seeing for homelessness and housing services, exacerbated but not created by the pandemic. So I don't have details on kind of the why this public work loans board had an impact on this, but I'm sure the concerns that any increase in the kind of cost of delivery is not helpful for local authorities.
Yes, I would agree with that any increased cost of delivery is significant, particularly given the financial crisis that local government is in. I mean, I think Public Works Loan Board, the impact of this will obviously vary by local authority, so it will have a greater impact in some areas than others, but I'm not sure what the reasoning behind that was. I couldn't give you any further on that, unfortunately.
Keith?
Just to say, I think it's a huge thing, and I've had conversations from a number of local authorities, and perhaps one of the reasons given for it was speculative expenditure in some English authorities' point of view. Both Unison and housing providers want to be on this case. It's like represents a huge tax. Can I just though ask if any of the panellists have any views on the impact that the absence of a UK budget will have on their ability and council's abilities to set budgets? Anybody first then?
Yes, so I'm happy to come in on that. I mean, I think we have been in this situation before, and the Scottish Government have been able to set budgets on an indicative basis, and I would urge them to do so in this instance. I know that COSLA have asked for a number of fiscal flexibilities to enable them to assist local authorities in getting through the period of the crisis. My understanding is that at least 3 of those 4 are in the gift of the Scottish Parliament. So the delay to a UK budget would not prevent those being put in place. What I would say, though, is those fiscal flexibilities are a short-term measure only. The fundamental issue is about how local government in Scotland is funded, and certainly what we have seen is that local authority budgets have decreased year on year over the last decade. Since 2013-14, local government budget has gone down by 7%. So the Scottish Government needs to take a decision to invest in local authorities and local service provision in a way that they haven't over the last decade. And they need to do that because the very workers that we're relying on to keep our country running right now are those on the front line in local authorities. They are the hidden heroes of this crisis.
You've already said that, Joanna.
And they need to be rewarded.
Okay. Kirsten, Callum, any you want to come in on this one? Callum?
Thanks. I think the main point, budgets, when we're building new social and affordable homes, we don't stop at the end of financial year. Local authorities need to have consistency across the piece, so we need to go from March to April seamlessly. Otherwise, without that confidence, we will find developments potentially slowing down, if not stopping. Anything that undermines confidence in what money is coming forward has the potential impact on a slowdown, and we often see that during the space in between big capital budgets or election cycles. So anything that undermines that is going to be problematic. I would also reflect, I believe in the Chamber yesterday, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance talked about the potential scope for increased money from the UK Government that would help support more social and affordable housing. That, to me, is if there's a chance to have more investment in social affordable housing and it's not being addressed because of the slowdown at UK level, that would be a concern to me. But fundamentally, we want to see more money into social and affordable housing.
Kirsten?
Yeah, so any delays or uncertainty around budgeting, as Callum said, can also impact on voluntary organisations. We will be quite far down the chain of where that funding goes, and we quite often take the brunt of cuts which are required to be made. The real issue around that, and particularly around delays for the voluntary sector, is that if we have to put our staff on a notice period, because the financial sustainability of voluntary organisations is in some cases such that there are no reserves and there is no slack to take up. If we don't know whether we'll get funding in 3 months, we have to put our staff on notice, can have really disastrous impacts for the projects that we run and the people who are supported, where those are really reliant on relationships that they have with those staff. And so we don't want that uncertainty to be filtering so far down the line that it has those impacts on our people and communities.
Keith, I'm going to have to draw you to a close, mate. Okay. Can I've just got something for Joanna.
Thanks.
You talk about this 61% ring fencing. That's a figure that everybody's a bit shocked about, I think. But you said that education is part of that 61% ring fencing. Are you suggesting that there's no flexibility for local authorities in how they spend any of their education budget at all?
I'm not saying that there is absolutely no flexibility. Obviously, a lot of the... Sorry?
You said it was ring fenced. I mean, you get budgets for education, etc. So it's a different thing.
Yes, so a lot of the money is passed straight on to schools and obviously to head teachers. So no, local authorities wouldn't be able to have discretion over how they spend that.
So it's spent in education, and you're suggesting that local authorities might want to take out of education to spend elsewhere?
No, I haven't said that. I've said that the total funding pot for local government needs to be increased. It's not taking from one service and giving to another. It's about increasing the totality of funding for local authorities.
You have made that argument, Joanna, and I accept that, but you have also, more than one occasion today, you've talked about 61% ring fencing. And
yes, it's a COSLA figure. It's their own figures.
Yeah, it may well be, but it doesn't seem to ring through when you're talking about if you're using the whole of education in it. Anyway, I need to move on to our last questioner, which is Alexander.
Thank you very much indeed, convener and panel. We've talked today about the resources. And the United Kingdom government has provided funding to Scotland in the Barnett consequentials, and from that the Scottish government have then disseminated money to local authorities. So can I ask about that funding that's come and has been distributed by the Scottish government? There was some dubiety about the length of time it took for them to receive that, councils themselves. And much of that money has been targeted by the local authority to support homelessness or health and social care, education, housing. So can I ask the panel what their views are about how effective and how efficient and effective councils have been at spending that money and using that money to manage the crises that we face at present?
Anybody in particular?
If Kirsten wants maybe to go first.
Yeah, so I think for us the issue is jointly around how much money is available, and as you say, how it is distributed. So a lot of the issues for the voluntary sector are of course around how much money flows into the sector at the end of the day, but they're also about how that money is given, and so that would speak to issues around procurement and commissioning of services in particular. So for me, that would highlight again the issues around the short-term nature of funding, which flows from local government into the voluntary sector, the element of competition, which can sometimes exclude smaller voluntary organisations from taking part, and a lack of a partnership approach and a lack of core funding that I've alluded to earlier. And so I guess all of those things would suggest that there are more efficient and effective distribute that funding when it comes to working with the sector. I would argue that the crisis has shown us that you can get more bang from your buck when we all work together in partnerships with that outcomes focus, rather than having a tight focus around the mechanics of how that money should be given out.
Joanna, you talked about there being about £1 billion adrift from councils. So how effective do you think the councils have been at spending the money that they received from the UK government, which is then trickled down from the Scottish government to local authorities?
So I think they've been certainly effective at spending it. I think the difficulties have been the delay in the time that it's taken to filter down, and the fact that some of these pots have come, they've been sort of drip fed throughout the period of the pandemic, and that has led to local authorities not being able to plan in terms of the funding that they're getting, when it might arrive. We've seen local authorities resetting their existing budgets midway through the financial year, and some taking longer term financial decisions which may or may not be to the benefit of service provision in the middle of a financial crisis, which I don't think is to the benefit of anybody.
And Callum, do you have any views on this?
I would echo much of what Joanna said. I think local authorities kind of rooted in their communities, working with the third sector and other partners actually are well placed to understand and deliver the services. The point I think has been kind of said by a number of times is about the access to the appropriate resources at the appropriate time. As we're dealing with an incredibly changing landscape, as we went into lockdown, we moved out of it. Local authorities need the resources to be able to respond to that, and I think that to me is the bigger challenge rather than the decision-making process within the councils themselves.
So my next question is, going forward, we have seen that councils have started to change the way they plan and the way they operate, particularly in how they support communities, and changing that in the long term. So as a result of the pandemic, do you see the future long-term processes being supported, and how might the Scottish Government change its support to ensure that communities do feel that they are supported going forward? Joanna, maybe you start?
Yes, thanks for that. I mean, I do think there will be some fundamental changes in terms of how authorities deliver some of the services as a result of the pandemic. We have seen a number of our members' roles change fundamentally during the period of the pandemic. If you look at some of how social care has been delivered, if you look at some of the child protection work that has been undertaken, social workers, there have been some changes to roles that will need to be job evaluated. That's an internal issue, obviously. But in terms of services in the community, I think we are going to have to see much more localised decision making, development of new income streams, and moving away from income streams which are dependent on some physical delivery of services that we may not be able to deliver in the longer term because of the continued restrictions.
And Kristen, and you gave some evidence to indicate there were some very special and some specific examples of good partnership working happening in your submission. Do you see that relationship continuing to improve, or is there going to be some friction about how that is managed when councils are looking at long-term issues?
So our anecdotal evidence would suggest that some of that partnership working is continuing and some is not, so it's maybe a little bit early days to say. But when we talk about councils changing how they plan, I think that what we all need to do is to recognise that the complexity of the situation that we all find ourselves in and the huge inequalities that we're seeking to all tackle require us to plan for the longer term, but they also require very many people to be around that table. So that includes the voluntary sector, and that's one of the other recommendations from last year's Equalities and Human Rights Committee report that hasn't yet been picked up around how the sector can be better involved in planning as well as delivery. But I think it's also really important to recognise that that's about having people with lived experience and who are using services and supports also around the table, and the voluntary sector can help with that, but we've got to come back to that Scottish approach to service design to really say, this is an issue that we can only tackle if we are all involved, not only involved in delivery, but also involved in design and planning.
And Callum, finally to finish, how do you see your sector coping with that, the long-term challenges and the long-term changes within the communities as you go forward?
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. So I think everybody, the committee today actually we've all had a new appreciation of what home means to us, where we want to live, what a home looks like, where it should be located, the things that matter to us, the services that matter to us. And that's going to have to change for local authorities, housing associations, developers. We're all going to rethink around actually what are the communities of the future going to look like. And that is going to move us on an incredible amount. We've got a government strategy, Housing 2040, I believe will go out later this year, and I'm hopeful that will kind of set the tone, or actually how new housing will look like over the future. But undoubtedly there's a challenge, but it's up to the housing sector to respond to that, to build the homes that people want and where they want. We can't continue just to build homes of a small size in areas that aren't desirable. We need to ensure that we build the right homes in the right places.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander. That completes our questions and concludes this evidence session. And I want to thank everybody who took part in the meeting for helping identify some key issues for the rest of the inquiry, and we'll be taking further evidence next week. That was a very useful session. Thank you very much for that. It concludes the public part of the meeting. We'll resume the meeting in private on Microsoft Teams. They're a little pressed for time this morning, so I propose we resume the meeting in private in 5 minutes. Okay, please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. You can exit the meeting by clicking on the red telephone icon. Thank you.